waddling down this alleyway holding munitions is this little girl. She's probably 6 years old, probably the same age as my daughter now, in a yellow dress. And, my heart sinks. One, because I know her. Call her the flower girl. She would hang out around the combat outpost and give everybody flowers, and we would give her chocolate and hugs, and she was super sweet. But the insurgency was smart. They knew that they could get kids to ferry weapons across the city, and we either had to kill them, which would enrage the local populace. Now you're killing kids, or you let them go and your friends die. What do you do?
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzullo.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzullo. Our guest today is award-winning author, veteran of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and mental health specialist Benjamin Sledge. After graduating from the Defense Language Institute and the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center, Ben deployed to Afghanistan in 2003 to build rapport with the indigenous population. He ended up serving on some of the hardest-hit fire bases along the Pakistani border. When he returned home 9 months later, he was psychologically shattered. Haunted by his experiences in Afghanistan, Ben embarked on a multi-year odyssey, wrestling with mental health, purpose, and faith, which eventually drove him to volunteer for another combat tour in Iraq during the Battle of Ramadi, one of the deadliest battles of the Iraq War. All of this is eloquently recounted in his award-winning book, Where Cowards Go to Die. Ben is going to share with us his experiences in combat and his struggle to heal from the mental trauma of war. I'm very honored to welcome Benjamin Sledge as today's hero behind the headlines. Let's just jump in.
Okay.
If you could talk a little bit about your background growing up in Oklahoma and then sort of how that led you into the military.
Yeah, so my family comes from a very long lineage of soldiers. My grandmother has traced our lineage as far back as a general who served under Napoleon.
Wow.
My grandfather was a paratrooper in World War II. My other grandfather, he served stateside, but my great uncle, his brother, stormed the beaches in the Pacific. Both my uncles entered the Army during the Vietnam era.
Oh.
My dad tried to enlist, but was barred because he had asthma, and then it just kind of trickled on down. So the Sledges just have always been, I don't know, soldiers in some way. So I grew up in Oklahoma with kind of that idealistic mindset of soldiers and Marines. And so I had posters on my wall, like the Be All You Can Be campaign back in the day, and then Semper Fi, along with Trans Ams and other fun stuff. But, grew up in a really good family home. Mom and dad I'm super close with. They met at Bible college. And so we grew up in a Christian household. But it was really interesting because growing up in Oklahoma during that time period, especially Tulsa, it was like kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
And my upbringing was very much kind of like the movie Footloose in some ways, like the old Kevin Bacon one.
Okay.
Not the new one, the old one, where it's like,
yeah.
Hey, you can't dance, you can't drink, and you better not be talking to girls, kind of thing. So I grew up, though, always as just this kid who loved music, and I got into hard rock and metal pretty early on. I still remember the first time I heard rock and roll and metal, and I was sitting on my neighbor's driveway, and they had a boombox. This is really dating me now. This is the 80s.
The old boomboxes, yeah. God. Yeah.
And they had the radio tuned in, and Guns N' Roses came on, and I just remember, I think it was Paradise City, and I just remember going, I've got to hear more music like this.
Yeah.
And that kind of created this like hidden obsession
Right.
with, hard rock and metal. And of course, everybody loved, Michael Jackson and the rest of the pop that was going on, New Kids on the Block during that day.
Right.
But my heart was really moved towards more of that kind of genre. And it just, it really spoke to me. I had hair down to my shoulders, like while I was a kid.
Yeah.
And got very involved in like, Metallica and Pantera and Slayer and Anthrax and the Big Four. And of course, I got ostracized because of that. And so not only was it coming from just my church background, but also my school background, I was like, this city sucks. I've got to get out of here.
Yeah, because that was like devil music in the 80s, right?
Yeah, man. Everyone thought you were going to like kick puppies and worship Satan.
Right.
By the time that I entered high school, I was like, man, this look is just not working for me. And so I like chopped off all my hair.
Yeah.
I went with like the spiky blonde tips, like Mark McGrath from Sugar Ray.
Right, I remember that. Yeah.
Started shopping at like Abercrombie and Fitch, and suddenly I was acceptable to society. And I found a group of guys that I actually ended up really enjoying, who I'm still close with and friends with to this day from high school. And they were kind of like in that middle ground where they really loved, we would go to concerts and metal shows, and yet we still kind of look like these preppy kids just to fit in. But eventually when, time came to decide like what I was going to do with my future, my parents were like, look, you're going to college. I'm like, great. How are we going to pay for that? They're like, figure it out.
Yeah.
And I was like, I guess I'm joining the military. And so I joined in 1999.
Wow.
Did this thing. It was called a split ops program, where I was able to do a portion of my training and then return home, go to college, and then finish up the rest of my training and go from there. So that's kind of my upbringing and how I ended up in the military. Just long family lineage and then just getting picked on, I guess.
Wow. You were in the reserves, right?
Mm-hmm. I was in the reserves. And so that's why I've always laughed at like kind of the people who are like, oh, Army Reserves. But I had joined a special operations detachment just because I literally thought it sounded cool. And I scored high on my ASVAB.
That's kind of unusual, isn't it?
Yes and no. So it's unusual now, but it still happens. Like if you see Tulsi Gabbard, she's a great example.
Yeah.
She's with a civil affairs unit, which was what my job was in the military, but she's on a special operations component side of that. So it's not unheard of.
Okay.
It's normal, just depending on where you go. 19th and 20th Special Forces Group or National Guard. So it really depends. And you'll have a lot of guys that'll come from the active duty side and then go over to the reserve, and they have backgrounds in special forces or special operations. So,
right.
But at the time, the Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command fell under the special operations community. And so I went to the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center in school right after the towers fell on September 25th, 2001. Wow. And that, like, literally when I got there, was so different from me being in basic training at Fort Benning and School of Infantry out there, because that was rough. It was brutal. Like, don't get me wrong. It was, 2000.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
But they were gearing up for war, and the cadre just completely reminded us, we don't have to give you sleep.
Yeah.
Because you're not under what's called TRADOC,
right? Which
is the Army Training Doctrine and Command. They're like, you're under special operations, and we will break you.
Wow.
And they did. Like, it was brutal. And so when I graduated from SWIC, I came home for 3 months, and then I got orders to Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, where I was going to learn a second language. And I was like, fantastic. Need to learn Arabic. And they're like, well, you're still aligned with Southcom, which is the Southern Command. So I ended up having a choice of Spanish, French, or Portuguese.
Gosh.
And so I chose Spanish because I knew that would help me in the long run.
Yeah, sure.
Walk out fluent, and that's January 2002. January 2003, sorry. Because during 2002, I was in language school. I'm home for 3 months.
Yeah.
We invade Iraq. A week after we invade Iraq, they call me and they're like, you're going to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, man. So it was literally, my life was just constantly I would leave for training, come home for 3 months, and then I'm back doing something.
Wow. And they sent you to like the worst part of Afghanistan at that time, right?
Yeah.
Firebase Skin, located on a high plain in Paktika province on the border with Pakistan, was known as the evilest place in Afghanistan when Ben served there in 2003. Resembling a cross between an old Wild West fort and the Alamo, enemy mortar and rocket attacks were constant. Making matters worse was the questionable loyalty of the Pakistani border guards and Afghan armed forces in the area. The remote location meant that help was a long way off if things took a turn for the worse, and the high elevation, 7,700 feet, meant that every patrol was grueling. This was the first time Ben had been in a combat theater. As a member of the 486th Civil Affairs Battalion, one of Ben's tasks was to help get girls' schools up and running. The problem was that every time Ben and his unit built a school, Al-Qaeda or the Taliban would blow it up. You know, you come from the States, and suddenly you're in Afghanistan. It's completely foreign to you, and you're getting shot at all the time. How did you deal with that psychologically?
So, growing up, I had that great family life where my parents are loving, they're supportive. They're the ones early on who are not pressuring me. My dad is in healthcare, he's director of nursing. They both have college degrees, and they never push me to be anything that I don't want to be. They're like, hey, we want to support you in what you do.
Right.
And so because I had that environment, never really suffered except for like getting picked on in middle school and high school.
Right. Suddenly
you head to combat and people start to die and like there's carnage and we end up at this place called Firebase Organee, which is in between these two mountain ranges. If you've ever seen the documentary Restrepo or watched The Outpost,
yeah,
it's very similar, especially in Restrepo because we had the exact same bunkers and they're just hammering that stuff.
Yeah. Like a target.
Yeah. They joked, like the joke was they just called it Rocket City because they would set up like Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or even the locals that they paid would set up, 107 millimeter rockets, which are these large Chinese made like artillery shells. I actually, I'll show you here real quick. And I don't know if your people can see this, but
oh, wow.
This is a part of the one that eventually got me.
Wow.
And that's only about maybe a quarter of it. So
that's a serious thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So they would just lob those into the base and people get hurt.
Yeah.
Guys that I knew started to get killed. One of my friends hit a landmine because Afghanistan's the most heavily mined country on earth due to the Soviet-Afghan war, like at the time. And you just wander off into minefields sometimes and wonder how you're gonna make it out. I was like, man, this is a savage environment.
Yeah.
And I didn't, I'm 21 when I first get there. I don't really know how to process what I'm seeing. And I think what happens to a lot of veterans is you get okay with the prospect of dying because you kind of adopt this sense of nihilism to a degree.
Yeah.
To where you're like, I'm going to die tomorrow potentially anyway. So why does anything matter?
Right.
And in order to survive, you really harden yourself. You harden yourself from the person that you knew. So I was this sweet kid, back home who loved art and took advanced placement art classes, as many as I could get. And I had, I wanted to go to college for art and graphic design and, sang in choir and did like all types of showman style.
Yeah, like
stuff.
a sensitive person. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely more poetic. And I get over there and I remember I wrote in my journal one day after we had gotten this big firefight and I run up this hill and I'm yelling and I'm screaming at everybody through my interpreter and, because we've almost died at this point. And there's just everything behind this mountain is rubble and ash. And I remember just how vivid that moment was. Like it's forever seared into my memory, like just how blue the sky was and just how fresh the air felt. And you have this heightened sense of being alive. But I came back and after the firefight, I go into my room And I kept a journal there. That's how I was able to write a lot of the book, was just I had the memories right there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I said, the Benjamin Sledge that everybody knew died on a mountain today.
Wow.
And I don't know if he's ever coming back. Yeah, so I adopted just this kind of I don't care attitude. I'm going to do what it takes to survive and make sure that we come home. Mm-hmm. And I was scared initially. I really was scared.
Sure.
Especially when I first got out there, or when I first arrived in country.
Yeah.
Once I got to the border and started experiencing combat, the weird part was I actually enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Which is, it's an old Hemingway quote that says, certainly there is nothing like the hunting of armed men, and those who have hunted armed men for long periods and enjoyed it desire nothing else.
Yeah.
And that became a very conflicted way for me to see the world.
So you develop this sort of persona, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of humor. Everybody's like playing jokes on one another to kind of keep it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much funny stuff that does happen in war, and you just have to figure out a way to release that tension.
Yeah.
And so you do crazy stuff. So initially my moniker was Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it was because I put on this brave face initially, I'm this crazy frat guy, college party kid. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to war, but internally I'm terrified, before I get over there and actually like combat. And so we are preparing to go to war, and so you're doing all these drills and these scenarios. They have actors that are speaking Urdu or Pashtun or Farsi or whatever it was. And then, you're doing these clearing operations and you're learning new weaponry and all this. So we go through this one exercise where they have like this simulated war, and we're inside this house that's supposed to be a village. And my fraternity brothers call and they want to know how to make this drink called Trash Can Punch, which is just like this liquor infused drink.
Right.
And I'm like on the phone. This is like the time of the flip phones, trying to get a signal. And I'm like yelling the ingredients while there's like simulated explosions going on. And we have simunition, which is like paintball, but in the actual AR-15s. And my team sergeant, Paul Gonzo Gonzalez. And I don't think I do him justice in the book, but because when people actually see him in real life, like I'm a big guy. Everyone's like, Sledge is a big guy. This dude is huge. He's a monster of his man. He's like 6'4", 6'5", and just stack, just like husky.
Yeah. Now his character comes across very strongly.
Yes.
It's just like this super dependable, solid guy, man.
That's him.
Yeah. Wow. Great guy.
I wish he would have got the nickname the Iceman, because that would have been so clutch for him. But, he was Gonzalez, so he was Gonzo.
Yeah, Gonzo works. It's good. I think it, yeah.
But yeah, the dude never really had fear. He just found war absurd, and the more absurd that it got, the more that he just kind of thrived in that environment. But anyway, He walks into the room, and he looks at me, and he can tell that I'm putting together this drink order for a party that I'm not even going to be at.
That's in Oklahoma.
It's in Oklahoma, yeah. And he's like, hey, Hollywood, get off the effing phone. And it was from this scene from a movie, a Jim Carrey movie.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch it, but it just stuck at that point. Everybody started calling me Hollywood. They're like, oh, look at this guy. He's Hollywood, wanting to be Hollywood. And
right.
And so then from there, I kind of started that trend to where we all started earning nicknames. Like one of the guys in the book, Blackie Robinson, is because, that was his quote unquote porn name, which you take your street and your first pet. And we just thought that was hilarious. And other soldiers did too. We had a girl who was in the headquarters element named Mother Goose, because she just oversaw everything. She was just very, motherly in that aspect. We had other guys who had like grotesque names. We had a guy who was a Mormon that we nicknamed the Mormon Assassin. And so and then Maximus was our, fearless leader who legit looked like Winston Churchill and would always just chew on cigars all day long. It was crazy.
Wow.
So that kind of humor and, us teasing each other and having fun built that camaraderie. But then at the same time, even when you're overseas, you start to pull pranks on people. So one of the biggest ones, I don't write about this in the book, but it's a funny story, is we had these what we called Haji Marts, which are these little local bazaars that they would set up outside the outskirts of camp. And soldiers, we have all this money that we can't spend on anything. So we would go there and buy stuff, whether it was blankets to stay warm in the winter. And they started selling these AK BB guns. Everybody bought AK BB guns. And then we started having a war inside a war. It got real meta real quick.
Wow.
Inside of our base, and we started arresting other people. And so anywhere you went around a corner, like even if you're just walking to like where you go get food or chow hall, you're like ducking around and you have your like AK-47 BB gun because you're afraid you're going to get pelted by one of the other guys.
Wow.
And it got out of hand. And so they had to step in and nuke all that stuff because we started arresting each other.
Yeah. God. So you really got into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so stuff like that happened. Yeah, when I was in Afghanistan. And then especially in Iraq.
Let's talk about the Burmel attack. How far into your deployment did that take place?
The Burmel massacre, that's what we called it, was where we had been helping out in these towns. We had been building girls' schools or doing reconstruction efforts or trying to bring them from the 15th century into the 20th century, basically, and be like, look, electricity, water, that kind of stuff.
And we're here to help you.
Yeah, but they didn't really care. They were more tribal oriented and tribute to warlords and stuff. But, we're trying to help. And Burmel was one of those cities that, really just a town that we were trying to help out. And it was a combined effort of both the Taliban and members of Al-Qaeda that went through and just massacred the entire village.
Because you had been helping them. Right.
Yeah, and they had been helping us in return and, feeding us intel here and there as needed. The weird part is after I got out of the military, I moved into mental health work and hold certifications in crisis response, trauma care, suicide prevention. And I've worked with even human trafficking victims. And it's interesting because we have similar experiences, though totally different, because when you go through something really horrific, the mind doesn't process it all that well. So it can sometimes just block and repress it. And so I'm not really sure what happened. I know I was there, but I was like kind of not there.
Yeah.
And, what I write about in my book is I remember like there's just flashes and images where like I'm pulling a human tooth from a wall and I remember somebody's head in the street. And they had decapitated a bunch of the men.
Wow.
They had massacred the entire police force. Organs are strewn out in the street. And I wrote about this all in my journal, write about it.
Yeah.
And it's just like kind of this weird, cold, calculated, like when I was writing the book, going back through it, I was like, good God. Like, and I'm trying to remember this. And it's like there's this film or this haze or fog over the memories.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I'm thinking of the guys you meet at the border. Those 7 guys. That was such a vivid scene to me.
People love that scene. It was literally, I was in a real life Mexican standoff.
Yeah, that's just wild. Yeah.
So we had gone, the way that the things worked initially, in Afghanistan and Iraq are two totally different environments. So let me explain that first. In Afghanistan, the area that I was in was heavily mountainous. It was the fire base that I was at was about 7,500 feet in elevation. So you could easily get up to a 14 or no problem because it was just literally like you're at that base and then up a mountain.
Yeah.
And the way that you would have to travel were through these dried up creek beds called wadis a lot of the time. And we would do this thing, which is called clear by fire, where we would go through this wadi and then you'd have a blind turn and you couldn't really see over it, but you knew that a lot of times like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda would set up ambushes up at the top, and when you turn that blind corner, they would just rain down hell.
Right.
And so clear by fire was we would start shooting Mark 19s, which are like explosives, and then 50 cals and stuff into the side of the mountain to see if we could draw that fire out and effectively go from there. So you're traveling a lot in these creek beds. So most of the time you would stage from the base, and then you would go out into these remote villages. You'd be out for like a week or 2 weeks, sleeping on the ground, waiting for ambushes. You've got this entire huge convoy that's with you. So it's nothing like Iraq where you're like going house to house.
Right.
And that's just because, once Alexander the Great marched through Afghanistan, that's kind of like where progress almost stopped in some places.
That's right. Yeah.
So when we went on this large scale clearing operation, we've got this huge convoy, like probably 70 trucks or something. I had tons of soldiers, and we're going out to the border with Pakistan, specifically in this area where they had tried to set up a fire base, and that met such fierce resistance that they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
And so
just where we want to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, everybody and their dog is out there. I'm with the 10th Mountain Division. The 3rd Special Forces Group is there. Task Force 5, which is this conglomeration of, SEALs and Rangers and Delta and all this. They're there. Some super spooky dudes named Prophet are there, which is, I think, was Gray Fox. They're very tier 1, like signals intelligence guys. There's the CIA contractors. So everyone and their dogs on this mission.
Yeah.
And we get tasked to go to this one area where there was a school that we had heard about where there was just like radicalism going on, and they were staging attacks. And so the school is right on the border, and the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan is disputed by about 20 miles. And so we show up on this ridge, and all of a sudden these dust trails start coming up. And this huge and we had broken off from the large convoy. There's probably maybe 8 trucks that we're with, 4 and 4. And so they start lining up. We line up. They've got, RPGs. They've got Soviet Dishkas, like on top of, which are, machine guns on top of their stuff. And they're all pointed at us.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, we're going to die.
Yeah.
And they're like, hey, get the interpreter. We got to get out. And I'm like gripping the steering wheel at this point.
Yeah.
And granted, this is before the up-armored Humvees existed that were bulletproof. So I am like literally in a soft skin where it can just tear through.
Right. You're ripped apart.
But I think I'm safe.
Yeah. Behind the wheel. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm safe behind the wheel.
Yeah.
And Gonzo was like, hey, Hollywood, get out of the truck. And I'm like, do I have to? And he was like, yes. So, and there's more to it to the story. So we start running, and I have this like early Gen 1, like kind of like video camera. And so I start filming, thinking like, if I die, at least somebody will know how this goes down.
Right.
And we meet with their like, I don't know, emissaries and ours.
Which is weird. Like nobody started shooting at one another.
Here's what's wild. We sat there for about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Just staring at each other. Everybody's fingers are on the trigger.
Right. Because it was like that mutually assured destruction type of thing. Like once somebody shoots, we're all dead probably.
Right.
Wow.
So we get out with the captain leading the convoy, and then it's me, Gonzo, and our interpreter. There's 4 of us.
Yeah.
And we start talking, and it literally turns into like a gentleman's trash talking session.
Yeah.
It's polite, but very backhanded.
Right.
And everybody's uneasy. You can see their fingers are moving more and more towards triggers and stuff. And, everybody's talking in hush when, the interpreter's talking. And, Gonzo is like, hey, the dude on the left, you kill him first. I've got this guy.
Right.
So we're literally preparing how we're going to kill these guys.
No, and they're badass, right? You're not quite sure who they are, actually.
We have no idea. We think they say that they are Pakistani border guards, and we've invaded into Pakistan.
No way.
And so that creates an international incident if you kill a bunch of Pakistani border guards.
Right.
So we're like, no, we're in Afghanistan still. They're like, no, this is Pakistan. We're like, no, we're looking for the school. They're like, that's in Pakistan. XYZ. It goes back and forth. And our interpreter gets more and more fidgety.
Yeah.
And he's like, these are bad men. We have to kill them. They're bad men. We got to kill them.
Right.
And I'm just like, we're going to go to jail if we kill these dudes.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an international incident. We're going to end up on CNN because Pakistan's our ally.
Yeah.
At this point in the war on terror, even though they're not.
Yeah, exactly.
And man, somehow we walked out of that without a single shot fired.
Wow.
Now, granted, we got ambushed the next day. So who knows?
Right.
But, well, actually, what's even funnier is once we got back, one of the special activity guys, we started riding around in their truck, and then we got out and they got hit. So it was just kind of wild all the way around.
Wow.
And they caught these guys. One of these they walked one dude. They caught him setting up this ambush, and one of the guys I knew walked him down a mountain with a shotgun in his mouth. I was just like, I mean, war's brutal. Just so you know, like I'm
right. Oh yeah. All the niceties go out the window.
Yeah,
fast.
and to kind of close out the story, when I got back, I turned over the video footage to some of the 3rd Special Forces guys, and they were like, all of these dudes are on our capture kill list. Why didn't you kill them?
Yeah.
And we were like,
well, we didn't know who they were.
Because
Yeah.
we didn't know who they were. And if we were in Pakistan, it would have been a bad deal.
Oh,
so.
sure. You would have, as you say, you would have been in jail. Yeah. You've been court-martialed.
Having fun in Gitmo.
Right. Yeah, that would not have been good. And then in the middle of it, a friend from high school you find out that he's killed, Kyle.
Oh, no, Kyle was in my unit. Kyle was my best friend.
Okay.
So Kyle was older than me.
Yeah.
His name's Danton Kyle Sightsinger. He was a sergeant when he got killed. He had been a Marine embassy guard.
Wow.
So he was in Rio de Janeiro, and he switched over to the civil affairs because he spoke Portuguese, and we're under Southcom. So I'm speaking Spanish, he speaks Portuguese. We figure we're going to be doing missions in South America, and he wants to get married to a Latino woman, And so he was actually supposed to be out of the army when he went over there, but they had put us on stop loss, and stop loss was what they did so that they wouldn't have to have a draft. It was literally, we understand that your enlistment and time in the military is up, but we're not going to let you leave. Your critical needs of the military.
Yeah.
And he was planning on staying in. He wanted to be a journalist and a writer, which is kind of funny considering, that's what happened to me now. And I think in some ways that's me just subconsciously carrying on his memory every day.
There's a connection there. Yeah.
So he and I were like inseparable. He would come visit all the time. He was my mom's like 3rd kid. He had his own key to my parents' house, and he would always
crazy.
My mom when he walked in the door.
What a character, man. Yeah.
And I've never met anybody who had such a zeal and a zest for life. Like, he would just literally honk the horn and start like waving at people or flipping them off, depending on what he was feeling like when he was driving, and just like jamming to music. And he was like, man, life is good, brother. Stuff like that. And he got over there, and his team, it was another group from our unit, replaced us. And a week later, he got killed in action.
And that was hard for you.
I had to present his medals to his parents.
Yeah.
My mom and I can't talk about him still. And before he died, he gave he'd gone on assignment for like the Miss Universe pageant down in like Panama. And so he brings this stupid fresco painting. It's ugly. It's terrible. And he gives it to my mom, and he's like, you have to keep this so you'll always remember me. She's like, Kyle, I'm not going to keep this. This is disgusting. And he's like, you have to put it in some place where everyone can see it. And he's teasing her and everything. And then he dies, and that fresco sits where everybody can see it now.
Yeah.
And it's totally out of place. But it's like a ghost that haunts our house now. So,
and you talk about his death as part of this sort of like hardening, dehumanizing process that almost started in basic training, right? But really picked up speed in Afghanistan, and it just continues.
Yeah. So he gets killed, and I'm going home, and I don't know how to live with who I am or what I've done or what I've seen anymore.
So your deployment ends, and you're back home, and
so I'm like, well, I suppose I need to get on with life. What do I do? And I'm staying at my parents' house for like a week, and then I'm like, well, I guess I should go to college. And college had started like a month ago. And so we call the university, and they make an extremely rare exception for me. And like, I go back to Oklahoma State trying to, live like a normal college kid, only that I can't anymore. and everything just feels broken.
Yeah.
I'm just angry at everybody. I don't know how to process what I've seen or done. So I start drinking a lot, and I had gotten injured in combat. That's the very first chapter, and we can easily skip over that. But basically, our base just got shellacked, and I got hit with a 107 millimeter rocket, and my best friend, he's my best friend now, but a guy that I was with was like bleeding out, and had to patch him up and get him to safety. But that's really where my time in combat ended. And then I just spent the last month at Kandahar and got to see Robin Williams perform for Christmas Eve. But so I'm still on pain medications at this point. Have just gotten the cast off on my hand because it had broken my wrist and superficial shrapnel wounds, and had a concussion, which we later now know is a traumatic brain injury. Just because the impact of the blast was so close. So part of me is like, and it was bad enough that when I first got injured, like
Wow.
I couldn't pair socks together. I knew it was wrong, but it's very common apparently. But I was matching white socks and then my like tan army socks together, and I couldn't figure out why it was wrong. And everybody's just laughing at me. So they're like, look at this moron. He can't even pair socks together. What a doofus.
Yeah.
And that's the way that military people are. It's like, oh, he got hurt.
Wow.
Let's make fun of him.
Yeah, that's rough.
So I come home, and obviously there's that going on in my brain. There's what I'm struggling with. And so I just start medicating myself.
Right. And your brothers, sort of brothers in arms, aren't there anymore, right? So you can't even joke with them or relate to them. You're just with almost like a different species almost, right?
Yeah. And so I become the angry, scary veteran that people are afraid of, and who's just, always on razor's edge, who will just blow up.
Yeah.
For no reason at all.
And so you decide to go back.
Yeah, it's funny. So eventually my parents and friends and fraternity brothers had an intervention with me. And that's when you've really screwed up. You wake up one morning and everybody's in the living room and you're like, uh-oh.
Right.
What's the occasion?
Yeah.
So I get into counseling, and it's good for me. It's hard. I'm still afraid to open up, but it does enough to where I can start living again. And I start to learn the tools and the techniques to kind of catch myself from slipping into the abyss. But, I start missing war like really bad. And I'm like, oh man, and to be honest, I still miss it. I miss it every day, which is a very bizarre thing to admit.
Yeah.
And I still think about it almost every day. It really has more to do with the relationships, the camaraderie, and the absolute devotion that you have for the men and women beside you.
And the sense of purpose, right?
Oh, the profound sense of purpose. So, I end the book with this. I really think the movie Rambo, the original one, was onto that.
Yeah.
Because, Rambo comes home and he's a Medal of Honor recipient.
Yeah.
And he's this special forces guy, and he goes to the town where his buddy had died. And, when he's laying siege to everything and Colonel Sam Trotman comes in, he just goes on this diatribe about how he used to have a mission. He had a purpose. People had his back. He could fly $1 million equipment and gunships. And now he can't even hold down a job, washing cars. And I think a lot of us, we come home and we enter the corporate world where, in the military, leaders eat last, and in the corporate world, leaders eat first. Yeah. They make profits. They don't take care of their employees, whereas we do in the military. We take care of Joe. That's what we do. We'll gladly take a bullet for each other, and the rest of the time, the employees are all trying to trample each other to get that raise, that promotion. And so you come home to an environment where you feel utterly and totally alienated. And you can't even talk to the people about the things that you've seen or done just because their body language totally betrays them. When you're like, haha, so we were like, this dude's head exploded. And they're like, dear God. Yeah. That's the freedom that I think we've given him for the last 20 years, is the freedom to be aloof they're like, well, what did it cost? I'm like, it cost us everything. It cost you nothing. You got to enjoy the comforts of home while we literally became so institutionalized by war. We just went on back-to-back deployments because it's what we knew. It's what gave us purpose.
According to Department of Defense data, since the U.S. went to war in Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, about 2.5 million members of the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard, and related Reserve and National Guard units have been deployed in the Afghanistan and Iraqi wars. Of those, more than a third deployed more than once. They did so voluntarily. You might wonder, why is that? According to author and filmmaker Sebastian Junger, men in combat form bonds that no one can match when they come home. The way he explains it, going shopping for baby diapers is no match for the adrenaline rush one gets while under fire with a small unit of men who form the most perfect emotional unit ever experienced on the planet.
Yeah, I was in South Padre Island, and we found out we invaded Iraq, and everybody started cheering.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it just had to do with 9/11 was still so fresh.
Sure.
That we wanted to believe
we're going to get revenge. Yeah, we're going to get back at these guys.
There's weapons of mass destruction, all types of other stuff. And really, it was just more of a foreign policy play so that we would keep our enemies fighting each other.
Right.
As opposed to another attack on American soil. But they didn't want to be like, look, we're going to preemptively go in and take out this, dictator, and it's because weapons of mass destruction. And everyone's like, well, it's really about oil. And I'm like, no, it was about foreign policy.
Yeah, it was.
Like when you look at it, it was simply had to be it was a foreign policy move for us to keep our enemies distracted, to destabilize the Middle East, to get the Sunnis and Shias fighting each other. We really just wanted to stick it to the Saudis and the Iranians, and those two hated each other.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go into Iraq. You decide to re-up. Is it your choice, or do you have to, given the policy, to deploy again?
So I was still on stop loss, and they were like, look, if you re-enlist, you'll get money. And I was like,
right.
Well, these wars aren't ending anytime soon. So
right. Yeah.
So I re-enlist, but I don't have to go to war just yet.
Okay.
Because you have what's called dwell time.
Okay.
To where they let you rest. Gonzo, he pins me up against a wall and he's like, hey man. And by this point, I'm a staff sergeant. I'm one of the most seasoned non-commissioned officers in our battalion because of, my combat experience and then, leading, and especially under Gonzo's leadership, because Gonzo was by far, he's a legend.
Yeah, you learn a lot from a guy like that. Yeah, yeah.
So he's a legend in our unit still. Like everybody knows him. He's still in the Army. When I met him, he was a sergeant. He made it all the way up to a sergeant first class, which is a senior non-commissioned officer. Then he switched over to become an officer, and now he's about to pick up lieutenant colonel.
Wow. Good for him.
Guy is living legend. Anyway, larger than life character. But
yeah,
he just, he pins me up against the wall, and he's like, hey, man, got a special team going to Iraq. You're coming with. And I'm like, no way, dude.
Yeah.
I'm like, I've just gotten married. You're about to have a baby. You're crazy.
Yeah. And I'm in school. Yeah. Yeah.
And he's like, look, man, sooner or later, we're going back over. He said, you might as well choose who you're going with.
Yeah.
That way you don't get killed and stacked with a bunch of idiots who don't know what they're doing. And he said, I've talked to Shanahan, and Shanahan was actually a very close family friend of ours who also happened to be in my unit.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the first sergeant at that point. I had met him when he was a younger sergeant as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, yeah, I want Sledge, man. So he tasked Gonzo to come talk to me. And here's the problem. Here's the problem with veterans.
Yeah.
There's this rhetorical question that your parents will always ask you when you do something dumb. It's, if all your friends were jumping off a bridge, would you do it? And of course the answer is supposed to be no. The problem with veterans is if all your vet buddies are doing it, you're in. He's like, most of the guys from Afghanistan are going. I was like, oh, crap.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, all right, well, give me to the end of the day. And he knew then that he had me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even the end of day. I was like, all right, I'm in. And so I volunteered
Wow.
to literally go to the epicenter of hell, which was, well, this time is bad. It's Ramadi, Iraq in 2006.
Worst time. In May 2006, the situation in Ramadi, a city of 500,000 located 68 miles north of Baghdad, was dire. Al-Qaeda had declared Ramadi the capital of a so-called New Islamic Caliphate, and with the support of about 5,000 Sunni insurgents, began systematically attacking the city's infrastructure in order to exert control over the population. They destroyed everything from cell phone towers to government leaders. The Battle of Ramadi between Al-Qaeda-led Sunni insurgents and U.S. and Iraqi government forces had a clear beginning, but no clear-cut end, and it was a battle fought on two main fronts. The first front was a highly lethal fight to wrest control of Ramadi back from Al-Qaeda. The second was a battle to link the population with the government of Iraq. In the end, it was a victory for the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines of 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division, called the Ready First Combat Team, and various special operations forces, predominantly U.S. Navy SEALs.
Ramadi was the most violent city on Earth during 2006 to 2007. It accounted for half of all deaths in the United States Marine Corps from 2006 to 2007, half of all daily attacks that happened in the country of Iraq.
Yeah.
So think about that.
Yeah.
Like there's an attack in Baghdad, attack in Mosul, attack in Basra. Half of all of them are just coming out of this one city that we're in.
Right.
And after Operation Phantom Fury, which was Fallujah, there was kind of this in tandem battle because Fallujah and Ramadi aren't too far from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So there was kind of this first battle in Ramadi that's going on while Phantom Fury and Fallujah is going on. But after the fall of Fallujah, all the fighters and insurgencies went over to Ramadi.
Yeah.
And Ramadi just became real bad.
Yeah.
And it's now so well known, and largely due to Chris Kyle, who was there while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Luttrell was there. I was just on his podcast. We were talking about how we were there at the same time. He's the lone survivor guy, and he was like, yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
Red Wings was bad, and Ramadi was real bad. And I was like,
Yeah.
dang.
Yeah.
Jocko Willink and Task Force Bruiser are there. Like everybody and their dogs there because of just how insane this place is. And it becomes the epicenter of how do we win the war effort. And that's really where, counterinsurgency coin
Right.
develops.
It was a Sunni area,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and the Sunnis were pissed.
Oh, yeah. Well,
They
if
were
you
super
think about it, it makes sense.
Yeah, of course it does.
Like if the Chinese government invaded the United States and then just wrecked your infrastructure,
Right.
You're going to set up an insurgency. So yeah, they didn't have power, water, sewage. Of course they're pissed. I'd go shoot at people too.
Yeah. I have a friend who was in the intelligence agency, and he's of Middle East background, right?
Mhm.
So they brought him in very early, right after the invasion, to talk to the Republican Guard because the units were still intact, right?
Yeah. Dumbest thing we did was fire them.
Yeah, and he said basically we were talking to them, and they were saying, "Hey, look, Saddam Hussein, we had our own issues with him, but we have our own esprit. We're intact. We're disciplined. You pay us, we'll do whatever you want. We'll pick up the garbage. We'll police the streets." And, they made the decision during the Bush administration to basically tell them, fuck off.
Yeah. That was Wolfowitz, man.
Yeah. And this guy had to deliver the message, and they were like, "You guys are crazy." And he goes, "I know. I tried to convince him, but that's the message." And that was like in April 2003. He said,
Yep.
The day after we delivered that message, that's when the insurgency started.
Yep.
He said there was no insurgency before that. There was some looting, but now they had their weapons, they had their command structure. We became the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it all started.
Well, think about that. Here you have professional soldiers who fought in the Iraq and Iran war who were receiving pensions and disability, just like in the United States, and you just nuked that?
Yeah.
How are they supposed to survive?
Yeah. So Ramadi was like, that's kind of where ISIS comes from. I mean, that was like at the center of everything.
ISIS, ISIL. Yeah.
And that's where you're sent.
Yeah. And what's even... So it's weird this year, the Marine Corps birthday, and I was there with Marines because Marines were there. So,
yeah.
But the Army came in and took over to like stabilize it started with 1st Armored Division and then moved over to the 3rd Infantry Division. And then, Marines, 1-6 Marines and 2-4, they were all in there. There was it was a conglomeration of all of us in this combined joint effort. And, some of my closest friends now are Marines because of the fact we fought side by side together.
Right.
And we worked in tandem with each other continually while we were there. I was always on patrols with Marines. I did clearing operations with Marines and, have such a massive amount of respect and love for them. It's just, I wish I could explain it more. And I know that they feel the same too.
Yeah.
Once you've kind of been together through that. But what's wild is this year on the Marine Corps, for their birthday message, they're going through like historical battles, and they're like, whether we've been fighting, in the sands of whatever, or Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima, and I'm like, these are famous battles.
Sure.
And then they end it with, or the streets of Ramadi, and I'm just like,
yeah, wow.
And now I live on the footsteps of Fort Carson. Like I can hear revelry and taps every single night, and when I meet guys in the Army that find out that I was in Ramadi, they look at you like you jumped into Normandy.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, well, this is weird.
Yeah.
So that's how bad it was.
Let's talk about the Christmas Eve mission.
Operation Kazarene. Yeah.
Yeah.
Operation Kazarene was a effort. It's part of one of the closing engagements of the Battle of Ramadi, which really lasted into early 2007 and kind of concluded with Operation Murfreesboro, which was down in the southeastern section of Ramadi and led by the 2nd Infantry Division down at Camp Corregidor. But this one was specifically with a Marine Expeditionary Unit that came into the city to help root out insurgents and clear the city. You would go to bed at night and you would just hear... just tracer rounds over the city. I mean, it always looks like the 4th of July. So
yeah. So you're finally like, okay, let's clean it out.
Yeah.
Let's go through. Yeah. Block by block.
Block by block, house to house. And so link up with Marine Expeditionary Unit. They're like, yo, we need interpreters. We need the civil affairs guys to minimize the civilian interference on the battlefield. And we had been there a while. So we're like, look, we can tell you everything.
Yeah.
We can tell you what roads to avoid. We got you. We know the people. We know who's dirty. We know who's good.
Right.
And so we go out on this dismounted patrol. So it's literally technically Christmas Day.
Yeah.
So I get to spend the day, Christmas Eve, whatever. And then Christmas Day, I'm literally poring over maps. And then that evening, which becomes December 26th, we stage and we walk out the front gate of Camp Ramadi and start heading down these major thoroughfares to clear the city.
And they know you're coming.
Oh, they know. Yeah, they know you're coming. At first, yeah, they knew we were coming, but they waited to stage for a few days, really. But the guy who was in charge of it was a officer named Major Scott Husing. And what's funny is we're friends now. And he ended up writing a book about his experience called Echo in Ramadi, which was about like some of the stuff that we went. And so he didn't know me at the time. He's like, yeah, so we take these civil affairs guys out with us too. And I'm like, hey, there we are. We're in his book. So great guy, fantastic leader. He was originally enlisted. And I was like, man, this guy, he's legit. Like, cause I hadn't really had good interactions with Marine Corps officers.
Yeah.
And he knew what was up.
Yeah.
And he left NCO business to non-commissioned officer business and really listened and paid attention to us. And so we went out this front gate and start clearing block by block. And by, I think it was like the 3rd or 4th day, situations got real hairy. People were starting to take sniper fire. And I'm with my lieutenant, and then the two other guys on my team, because we run in 4-man teams called CAT A's. They stand for Civil Affairs Team Alpha. It's kind of like, the same way that the A team worked, You have Operational Detachment Alpha. So you have your Civil Affairs Team Alpha. And so we split up to go with different platoons of these Marines. And so they clear one side of the city, we're clearing the other side. And all of a sudden we end up on this road called Millions, which has like 1 million IEDs on it. And the Marines don't know this. And I'm like, we have got to get off this road. We're going to die. And we see these guys, these military age males and kind of older males start peeking around corners and showing up and everywhere. And so I tell the Marine lieutenant, and my lieutenant tells the Marine lieutenant, yo, we got to get out of here. They radio one of the combat outposts, which is like a group of houses that we've taken over in the middle of the city. And they're like, yo, that road is bad. You guys got to get off of there right now. So we run and we book it to Combat Outpost Steel. And I go up to the roof and I meet with the first sergeant, and he's like, yo, are your other guys on the other side of the city? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, we got troops in contact. So I go to the roof. There's smoke plumes billowing over, just like not far from us.
Yeah.
And what I didn't know at the time was that my two guys are in the fight of their lives.
Wow.
Where it's them on a rooftop taking on 20 or more insurgents, and they are pinned down, and they're holding down the rooftop until the Marines can get up there.
Yeah.
And they're shooting through this drainage area where they had all been peeing through. So my buddy said he's just up there and he's like, just my nose and eyes are watering while I'm pulling the trigger, trying to take out these insurgents. So they're pinned down.
Yeah.
We start taking fire on the rooftop of Cop Steel, where I'm at, where we had retreated after we got to Millions. So me and this first sergeant on there, the Marines are down in the courtyard, and it's just me with a couple other sniper teams up there. We start lighting up this alleyway. This mosque goes crazy because, there was this mosque nearby that was very sympathetic to the insurgency. And anytime firefights would go off, he'd give these calls to prayers. They weren't even calls to prayer. They were calls to action.
But speakers start.
Yeah, speakers start. So it starts going, and you can't shoot them off because it's a war crime.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, apparently.
Huh.
So he starts riling up, and all of a sudden, firing off some rounds in the alleyway. I can't really see anything. When you're a soldier, you just do dumb stuff. Sometimes you're like, I think it's coming there. I'm just going to shoot in that direction.
Right.
So that's what I'm doing. I'm just firing off rounds in this alleyway and other places. And we stop, and I'm running a red dot EOTech for close quarters combat. And then the first sergeant that I'm with, he's running a ACOG, which has a little bit more of a scope, and his has powerage to it. And he goes, hey man, swap me weapons real quick. So I do. And he goes, take a look. And waddling down this alleyway holding munitions is this little girl. She's probably 6 years old, probably the same age as my daughter now.
God.
In a yellow dress. And, my heart sinks.
Yeah.
And I'm like, because I know her.
Yeah.
Call her the flower girl. She would hang out around the combat outpost and give everybody flowers, and we would give her chocolate and hugs. And she was super sweet.
Yeah.
But the insurgency was smart. They knew that they could get kids to ferry weapons across the city, and we either had to kill them, which would enrage the local populace. Now you're killing kids, or you let them go and your friends die.
Yeah.
What do you do?
And you're the civil affairs officer.
Yeah. I'm the platoon sergeant.
Makes it even worse for you.
Yeah. So the first sergeant just goes, rules of engagement are clear, man. She's an enemy combatant at this point.
Yeah.
You could shoot her technically. And, at that point, I'm just staring through this scope, fingers over the trigger, and I'm just like, everything inside me is just, wow. And I'm like, what if Starnes and Wagner die? Those are my two guys.
Right.
And then it's like, yeah, but you'd never be able to live with yourself. And it's just back and forth and back and forth.
There's no way to win in a situation like that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So eventually I flipped the selector to safe, hand it back to him, and can't even formulate the words. And he just laughs and, says a string of expletives, calls me a sick fuck,
Yeah.
And then he's like, look, man, he's like, we're American soldiers. We don't shoot kids if we don't have to.
Yeah.
And he was like, you made the right choice. He was like, you did.
Right.
And he was like, however this turns out, you made the right choice. And I was like, all right.
Yeah.
So luckily my guys survived, and heroic actions that day, just this crazy stuff, and so we made it back after that operation.
Wow. Did you ever see that girl again?
Yeah, I did.
Oh my God.
I told her, don't carry fucking munitions next time.
Wow.
Yeah, she came.
Crazy.
She came to combat outpost and gave us some. I gave her some chocolate.
How crazy, man. How crazy. Makes no sense.
It literally makes
She
zero
probably
sense.
didn't even know what she was doing. Yeah.
She had no idea. They probably offered her some like candy or some money for her family.
Right.
And she was like, sure. They just don't know any better.
Yeah.
And even the teenagers, a lot of times, they just become indoctrinated or radicalized to this idea. And unfortunately, I knew guys that I served with that did kill and had to kill kids because they got charged with an AK-47 or they were just laying out IEDs.
Yeah. God. Let's talk about Father
Rochford.
Yeah. Because in the middle of all of this insanity, you stop in the base chapel one time.
Yeah.
And you run into this father.
Yeah. So at the time, I would say I was agnostic at best, atheist at worst, because I had embraced like kind of that nihilism. My wife at the time was Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get drunk on like this bootleg hooch that she shipped over and other friends have shipped over. And we're off mission the next day. So we have some time off. And so we all start drinking. I get super wasted. And then, the drunker I get, the more angry I am just about the situations and scenarios that I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm realizing more and more that I'm a pawn in almost in the American industrial political complex.
Yep.
Which is very difficult to handle because, I'm a very patriotic person who loves this country, who loves the people in it, will gladly die for them. And yet I'm just seeing, Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the aisle check on their investments and getting rich and, selling us a load of garbage. And,
right.
And you don't feel like you can talk about that per se, but a lot of us felt that way. We just didn't express it. We were there because we were fighting for the men next to us.
Right.
And that's really what it boiled down to.
Yeah.
So I'm angry and I want to blame somebody. So there's this chapel and I'm like, I guess I'll blame God.
Right. Yeah. Well, it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I throw this liquor bottle at the building and I was like, you idiot. I was like, I'll get it in the morning. So in the morning, I go over to get it and I scrape off the label and dispose of it in the trash so that we don't get in trouble. And just curiosity gets the better of me because, I'd grown up in church. And so I walk in the chapel and I'm looking around and, it's the one chapel on base. So you have the Catholics, you have the Protestants, you've got everybody there. Basically. And so it looks like, the chapel doesn't know who's in charge, whether it's the Pope or Martin Luther.
Right.
I'm walking towards the front, I'm touching the pews, and all of a sudden I hear this voice behind me say, "Can I help you, my child?" And, I whirl real quick. And it's Chaplain. And he's in Marine Corps fatigues. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Pastor." And he's like, "Father, actually." And I was like, "Oh, crap. Now I'm here with a priest."
Right.
And so, I kind of go to make my way past him. And he's like, "What brings you in here today?" And I'm like, curiosity, nostalgia. I don't know.
Yeah.
We start talking and come to find out this dude's a Vietnam veteran.
Yeah.
And not just any Vietnam vet. He's like an infantry grunt Vietnam veteran. He'd been wounded in action during the Tet Offensive. He's one of 6 guys out of his company, out of 150, to live through the Tet Offensive.
Wow.
One of 6.
Incredible.
So everyone on base, like once you kind of learned who he was, you were like, "Oh, Father," you're like, he's a badass. Like, he can counsel.
He's not what I thought he was. Yeah.
Yeah. And he would also run like with the troops. He was just a hard charger, So I just start hanging out with him because I like him.
Yeah.
He's a cool dude.
Right.
Come to find out he's an alcoholic too, on and off the wagon. over the years, just because of what he's, endured.
Sure.
And then on top of that, he's the only priest in all of the Anbar province. So he's doing all the funerals and last rites for soldiers.
Wow. Talk about service, man.
Yeah.
That's rough.
So it explains why he was an alcoholic. I mean, I get it at that point.
Sure.
So on, and he admits he's like on and off the wagon. He's like, when I'm overseas, it's easier because I'm here and you can't drink, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we just start having, conversations about the divine and life and purpose and meaning and stuff. And, my background and my own church hurt growing up. And I'm just like, man, this guy is like one of the most authentic dudes I've ever met.
Yeah.
Probably like the most authentic Christian I've ever met.
Yeah.
Because my wife's Catholic, I was like, you know what? I should get confirmed and this will help out my marriage and stuff. And so I do. Don't really believe. It's more of just kind of that cultural moment. But his tour of duty ends. And so he gives me his Bible.
Yeah.
And tells me, like, hey, why don't you stay in touch? And when you get home, please reach out. I'm like, for sure. He's like, I run a parish in Massachusetts.
Uh-huh.
I'd love for you to give me a call one day. And I was like, I promise I will.
Yeah.
But, the travesty is that I call years later. I finally call because I end up going to a church when I come home and I meet these people and these Christians who take care of me and love me.
Yeah.
And walk with me through the pain and trauma of combat and divorce and everything. And so, when I get remarried, my wife is like, hey, you always talk about this priest who planted like kind of these seeds of faith in you.
Yeah.
How come you've never reached out? And I was like, yeah, that's a good point. And so, for years, like behind me, you can see I have what's called a shadow box. So all my awards and medals and stuff, I would just keep them in a box in the garage.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was just like, I'm going to get busy living after war. I don't need to talk about this. And it just, it ate me from the inside. But so I had this box in the garage where his Bible was. And I went out and picked it up and, opened it, and it has like all my memorabilia, some of my gear, stuff that I've collected from combat. And, the little note falls out with the number to his parish. So I call. And the woman on the end, she's real cheery, and I'm like, hey, I served in Iraq with Father Dennis Rochford. I said he was instrumental in like my faith journey. I said I'd love to talk to him, and I'm just reaching out. And like, there's no answer on the other end, and I'm like, hello? Did the call drop? And she just goes, sir, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Father Rochford passed some time ago. And I'm like, how? Like he seemed pretty healthy. And
yeah.
And she goes, it's best if we remember the departed as they were. And I know what Catholics mean when they say that.
Yeah.
And so now I'm angry and I fear the worst, and just through gritted teeth, I go, how?
Yeah.
And she goes, suicide. And
wow.
I found out that on September 10th of 2009, he drove from his home in Narragansett to the Newport Bridge, and he parked his car in the middle lane. And then he like walked over to the edge for a minute, and people are watching him at this point. It's like, who's this dude?
Yeah, sure.
Stares for a minute and then jumps over the side.
Wow.
And was pronounced dead on the scene. And I was just like, good night. And I get it. That dude carried everybody else's burdens.
Yeah.
Nobody carried his.
Wow. What a hero. Wow. Well, thankfully, by the time you heard that news, you were in a better place.
It was, yeah. It was brutal, though. I mean,
I just wanted to go back because there's something that we have to talk about, and that is the dentist. that I think just kind of shows you like how far out you guys got.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Night
at the dentist. That's what we refer to it as. Oh my gosh. Starnes and I recently, Starnes is the guy, he was my corporal in my Cat A team. We're super close, call each other, talk to each other, text way more than we should, like all the time. We went on a hunting trip in South Africa not too long ago.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
nice.
he's very successful now, and he's like, "Hey, man,
oh, good.
You're coming to South Africa with me." I was like, "Okay, since you're paying, I'm in."
Yeah.
So we go on this hunting trip, and we're with a bunch of guys we don't know, and we end up telling this story, and they are in tears laughing.
Yeah.
So we, you do dumb stuff in war to blow off steam. So we make friends with these British contractors who are private security. They're kind of like the Blackwater version of the British or British Blackwater.
Mm-hmm.
And they're at the company called Sabre. So they run missions to the Green Zone. We've run a few missions for them. We're like, hey, can you pick us up some beer? They're like, yep, for sure. So they pick us up beer. And then the dentist had picked up some wine, and we'd become friends on base. We just met them randomly.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was the dentist and the dental assistant. And and so we go over and we're like, oh, we're gonna have a chill guys night. At the dentist, we're gonna play some darts and cards. We're gonna drink a little wine and beer, and it'll be fun.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in the military is like a chills guy night that involves like alcohol a lot of times.
Right.
And so we all end up getting drunk, and then it proceeds to go downhill from there, where I'm like, hey, do you guys got laughing gas? And the dentist is like, no, they keep that under lock and key. And I was like, oh, dang, that would have been hilarious. All of us would have just been laughing at the little thing on our face.
Right.
But then I get this bright idea. I'm like, do you guys got Novocaine?
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, but why do you want Novocaine? And I'm like, all right, here's what we're going to do. I was like, I'm going to get in the chair. You guys are going to inject me in the face with Novocaine, and then you're going to punch me in the face as hard as you can. And, I'm thinking like Tyler Durden from Fight Club at this point.
Right.
And so they're like, hell yeah, because the minute you introduce violence into a soldier's world, they're like in love. It's like, oh, now we've added now just
we're
booze,
really playing. Right.
violence as well.
Right.
And so eventually it gets to the point where they're just injecting me all over the place. They let Starnes, my corporal, get the syringe, and he injects me into the face, and then they just start punching me as hard as they can.
Wow.
And at that point, like, I am just drooling because I can't feel anything in my face.
Of course. Yeah.
Just totally numb.
And they're just wailing on you.
Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I can't feel a thing,
Oh,
and then by the end of the night, we're all throwing darts at each other too. So like trying to avoid.
Wow.
So everybody has like dart wounds all over their body, and we're being brutal about it. So like,
yeah.
It's like that that part in Old School where Will Ferrell walks up at the kids' party and he picks up the tranquilizer gun and he shoots himself in the neck, and then Sean William Scott's like, you got a dart in your neck, man. That's not cool,
Yeah,
and it was like that. We're like, you got a dart in your arm, man.
Right. Jeez.
So then we decide to leave. Starnes and I eventually, and we, by this point I can talk, and I'm like, oh, it's late, we need to get rolling. And we had driven our Humvee over there because it was about, less than a half mile from our place, but we're transporting alcohol, which you can't have. So,
yeah.
So we have to have some way to hide it. And I look at Starnes and I'm like, are you cool to drive? And he's like, nope. And I was like, me neither. And I was like, all right, you drive and I'll be the TC, which is the transportation coordinator, which is like look out for road hazards.
Yeah.
And this is as Ramadi has kind of begun to wind down and it's more chill. So the 3rd Infantry Division starts just their officers start doing crazy stuff. Like they start putting checkpoints on base for whatever reason. I have no idea.
On base?
Yeah, on base. And I guess it was because they wanted the MPs to do something.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, and we had heard rumors of it, and we're like, that's the dumbest thing. We bet it's just a rumor. Well, sure enough, there's a checkpoint. And we're rolling up, and I'm like, uh-oh. And Storm's like, what do we do?
Yeah.
And I go, turn off the lights and floor it.
Wow.
And he goes, what? And I go, turn off the lights and floor it. That's an order.
Right.
And he smiles real big because I can see like kind of his teeth a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah,
you know, and then he just turns the light off and floors it past this checkpoint. Like,
Oh my
we go to
God.
our hooch, he like power slides in. And I always remember this because he runs over this huge camel spider on the way in. And then we slam the doors and we run in like these giddy morons. And the next day I forget about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I wake up and I'm like, why does my jaw hurt so bad?
Yeah.
And Wegner, the other guy on my team, is like, because you ran from the police
Yeah.
and you had everybody punch you in the face. And I'm just
Yeah.
like, oh yeah. And so,
Good times, man.
Yeah.
Good times.
that's what
Wow.
war is like. Insanity, debauchery.
A recent study by MarketWatch looked at professions with the highest divorce rates among people under 30 based on U.S. Census Bureau data. 3 of the top 10 professions involve military jobs. First-line enlisted military supervisors had the highest divorce rate at 30%. These are personnel who lead military operations and supervise enlisted service members. Enlisted personnel who deal with air weapons and tactical operations were number 4 at over 15%. And military service members of unspecified rank were 7th at just under 15%. Those numbers compare to an average divorce rate across all professions of 2.5%. The Census Bureau study found that the average rate for divorce among military personnel is 30, and first-time marriages reflected approximately 41% of all breakups. Stress, mental health issues, and insufficient income were contributing factors. You come to November of 07, and it's time to go back. Just before you leave, you get a call from your wife
Yeah.
saying, I want a divorce. And then you're back in, you return to Houston to an apartment you've never been in before.
It was a house. We had bought a house that I had never lived in.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That must have been the weirdest, like, alienated feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like everything was just piled up on you, man. Not only are you returning, your wife has just told you it's over.
Mhm.
Going to a house that you bought that you'd never been in before. You'd never lived in Houston before, right?
Mm-mm.
You didn't know anybody there. I mean, wow.
Yeah. She had said, I want to move to Houston to be close to my family. And I said, obviously, I'm going to be gone for, it was a 15-month deployment, but you're gone for like a year and a half with training and everything else.
Yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense. You need to have a support network and all that. But,
Yeah.
out of the 4 years that we were together dating and married, I was only home for like a year and 9 months because I was constantly gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it never really gave us much time to have a relationship. And we just had this toxic,
Yeah.
just relationship. So, and I was an unhealthy person at the time too. I was very unhealthy.
Right.
And so, my parents, they're like, fly to Oklahoma, come stay with us. And I'm like, no, I got to fix this. I can fix this.
Yeah.
So I go home. I can't fix it.
Yeah.
She won't even pick me up from the airport. So I legit have to rent a car and get a map because iPhones had just come out at that point.
Yeah.
And so I'm like on a map in like the city of Houston because I arrive in Houston Hobby Airport and I'm like,
Where's my house?
where's my house? And I'm like, can you please pick me up? And she's like, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm like,
Wow.
what kind of dystopian planet am I on right now?
Right. I just came through hell, man.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I rent this car and I eventually find the house and she's there with her brother who is a fellow combat vet who is in Iraq at the same time as I got home a little bit earlier. And I could tell he was pissed at her that, there's just lines you don't cross, but he's there to support her. And
Sure.
he also knows that like I just came from a very violent environment. So it probably makes sense. You don't want a violent dude around a woman who just left him.
Right.
So he once he could tell, I wasn't going to be a threat or anything. At this point, I'm just so worn out and depressed that like I'm just like I don't care. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
she lets me in the house, and she's like, house is yours. I've got my own apartment. I was like,
Yeah.
this is bad.
Yeah.
She's like, you can keep the bed and the furniture. And I was just like, this sucks, and eventually
Yeah.
she's like, hey, look, divorce papers are on the coffee table. Like, I suggest you sign them.
Yeah.
And I just realized, like, this is not, she doesn't love me anymore, and that's it. Yeah, I can't salvage it. And I try, and it just makes her angry.
Yeah.
And so she leaves, and I'm just like, oh my God, what do I do?
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah. You're kind of left at the garbage dump. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Just kind of dumped off to the side of the road.
The house is very sparse. There's like a couch.
Yeah.
There's no TV.
Yeah.
So I can't even watch TV.
Yeah.
There's a bed, and I'm still in my uniform. I haven't even unpacked or anything. And I'm staring at this place, and I'm like, I don't know what to do
Yeah.
with my life or anything at this point.
Yep.
And my phone rings because I just reactivated. It's, one of the old Motorola flip phone thingies.
Yeah.
And it's one of my best friends from college. We had met through my ex-wife, and
Yeah.
we're all mutual friends. And he's like, oh my God, Ben, I've been trying to get a hold of you. He's like, oh, thank God. He was like, where are you?
Yeah.
And I was like, Houston, dude. And he was like, are you alone? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, dude, you cannot stay there. He's like, I heard about what happened.
Yeah.
He's like, you need to come stay with me. And I was like, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I was like, I just got home.
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, you're literally alone. He's like, what do you have left for you there?
Right.
He's like, I got a pot of coffee and a case of beer. He's like, we can stay up all night. And I'm like, okay. Because he lives in Austin, which is about, from where I was on the outskirts of Houston.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's about an hour and a half drive to his place.
That guy did you a solid, man.
Mhm.
He really
Yeah.
did. He really did. Wow.
Yeah. So Bill and I are still super close. He lives, I live in Colorado now. He lives in Florida, but, we were buddies from high school or college and beyond.
Yeah. No, you're lucky to have a friend like that, man.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Because he really did. He changed the trajectory of my life. And so I ended up living on his couch because I was like, I don't know what to do with this house. And we both owned it. And so
Yeah.
we just started renting it out because here's the best part of this story. The subprime lending crisis hit
Oh, yeah.
right as I got home.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was upside down on a house.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah. So you got hit with everything.
Yeah. So I lived on his couch.
Yeah. But you pulled yourself out of it with the help of some friends and a church, and,
Yeah.
found your way back to faith and God. And now you're helping other veterans, right? Because as you write very, beautifully in the book, it's hard for, people who have been through things like this to talk about it.
Yeah, so the way that it worked is after I got home, I moved into geopolitical intelligence for a company. And, because my skills translated easily from the military from that. And then on top of that, just with, me getting involved in church and finding faith again. And then, the friends that I begin to make, that's when really kind of the height of the veteran suicide epidemic really kind of came into place.
Yeah.
And that's when we were losing 22 a day.
Yeah.
Now it's down to like 17.5. But it became very aware to the public that something was wrong with all of us. And I was like, well, no shit. Most people think it's like Call of Duty and then they read my book.
Right.
And I got a message the other day from a friend of mine who I grew up with. She's much younger. I was, friends with her parents, but she said, your book was so uncomfortable to read because she said, basically as a soldier, you indirectly mortalized yourself to me, but as an author, you directly immortalized the suffering that incurred for my own enlightenment.
Well, that's the beauty of your book, man, because you track that psychological progression that you go through from this kid who just wants to get through it alive, and you become harder and harder and harder and more alienated from society. Mm-hmm. And then when you go back to society, you're on your own.
And that's the biggest issue that we're seeing. It's not just the GWAT veterans, like, Iraq and Afghanistan. It's also the Vietnam veterans. They are actually the ones that are actively ending their lives by suicide at the largest rates.
Yep.
Here's the reason why. Some of this is conjecture. I think a lot of it I can back up with data and facts, though, is when they returned home from war, they got busy living their lives.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want people to know that they were soldiers. They didn't want to get spit on. There was a draft, largely unpopular. So they went to work.
Yeah.
And they went about raising their kids, the Gen Xers and my generations and some of the millennials. And they got after their life, and they were able to bury those experiences with, this kind of profound sense of purpose that I'm going to put this all behind me. And then here's the thing, the Vietnam veterans are retiring in mass now because they're part of the boomer generation.
Yeah.
And they have nothing left but time.
Yeah.
And eventually all that suppressed trauma is going to come back, and they can't live with what they did.
Sure.
I was talking to a guy here on the street the other day, and this is going to be a weird segue. It's going to sound strange.
No. That's okay.
But he works at a dispensary because, marijuana is legal here in Colorado. So I said, "Hey man, how many Vietnam veterans do you get?" And he goes, "Oh, they're in here all the time."
Yeah.
And he goes, "And they all smoke the same shit."
Yeah.
And this dude was an Army vet too that I was talking to that worked at this dispensary. He goes, "They're all one bullet away from a dirt nap."
Yeah. No, Vietnam, it was ugly, man. I mean, they all are.
It's similar to Vietnam and different. Like,
yeah,
I am so thankful to the civilian populace for their support during those 20 years, to where I wasn't coming home and being called a baby killer. And
right.
They say thank you. They don't know what to say, so they just say thank you. And that, I'm cool with that. I'm like, give me my Applebee's and chili freebies on Veterans Day. I'm going to take it.
Right.
I'm totally happy to do that.
Sure.
I always make it a point, though, to thank Vietnam veterans and say thank you, because you were endured treatment so badly that I didn't have to.
Yeah.
But also in the same manner, like, coming home has been extremely difficult, and it's difficult some days still, just because of the fact that you're in those environments so long, and the rest of the country was aloof.
Yeah.
And then it's like these politicians made these horrific calls, and it's because I think it should be a law that you can't serve in any form of Congress unless you've served in the military or Peace Corps, at least.
I agree with you. Yeah, this idea that, like, a lot of them haven't even been overseas. It's like, no.
Yeah, but now to get back to the question at hand, like, I went to work inside mental health. It was a nonprofit called Heart Sport that was started by Jake Lors. He's the lead singer of a Grammy-nominated metal band called August Burns Red, and he began to hear about, the stories from his fans, and a lot of those fans were veterans. And he wanted, and I figured, I can work in mental health and just kind of catch veterans on the side, but I didn't want to be that guy, because at the time, you get labeled as the touchy-feely wimp, and
right. And
then, like, just, he would really push me to kind of talk about it, and I could never talk about it.
Yeah.
I was just always this enigma to my friends, and an enigma even to my own wife,
Mm-hmm.
And the more that I tried to fight it, the more that I realized that I needed to help other people. And I saw, like, in my coursework and working with people who were suicidal, what the real cause was. And so I ended up taking this course with Dr. Kent Corso. He's a leading suicidologist. He was in the Air Force. Fascinating guy, and just picked his brain, because everybody else was non-veteran. And I was like, I'm going to be the dude and who asks, like, all the questions. And the thing that I really realized, and this is true, is people choose suicide because of the fact that they don't know how to alleviate their suffering. Yeah. If they could alleviate their suffering, then there would be no reason to self-terminate.
Right.
Because that's the human condition, fight or flight.
Right, exactly.
And so you're either going to fight or you're going to flee. And
right.
You do technically, as a human species, do not want to self-terminate. But the thing is you feel so awful, you don't know how to alleviate that suffering. And what a lot of veterans are going through is they don't know how to process that trauma, that pain.
Mm-hmm.
ingratiating into a world again. I think a lot of them are dealing with transition disorders as opposed to post-traumatic stress. And honestly, I think post-traumatic stress has just been kind of this catch-all term that we've lobbed when you have these experiences that I described that do more psychological damage to the soul, which we now know as moral injury. It's like where you have to do things that violate your sense of right and wrong, killing a woman or child, or like killing another human being, watching that carnage.
And you're left with that, and nobody is helping you cure it or even understanding it, right?
Right. And there's a key component that we're missing in the clinical studies and especially when they begin talking about resistant treatment, post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think is really just more moral injury, is we have so greatly reduced human beings to like almost like a single-celled organism, forgetting that we are emotional, that we are physical, that we are intellectual, that we have existential crisis, and then there's a spiritual component.
Absolutely.
And many clinicians are forgetting about the spiritual component. Moral injury, actually, research right now is being led by Bright Divinity. They're doing the most studies on it. It's very fascinating. Mm-hmm. But I bring this point up in my book, and this is why it's so vital to talk to veterans about the spiritual aspect of war. And the only other person that I know that's done this is the author Karl Marlantes, who wrote What It's Like to Go to War in Matterhorn. Phenomenal books. Totally
check it out.
Helped, my writing.
Okay.
But in war, it's like playing God.
Yeah. Because
you have the power to protect life or take it away. And either way, whether you believe God or not, there's a spiritual component to it because of this simple fact.
Yeah.
Most of us think we know what's going to happen when we're going to die, even if we're kind of unsure, whether that's based on a religious belief.
Yeah.
And we're fairly certain of that based on our own convictions. Like, if I'm a Christian, it's going to be heaven. If I'm a Buddhist, it's going to be reincarnation.
Right.
If I'm a secular humanist, it's going to be the great nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing. There's no formative consensus or science behind what happens when you die.
That's right.
And so when you pull the trigger and you send a man or woman into the great unknown, there is something very spiritual about that.
Sure.
And these clinicians and people that are not talking about that aspect are screwing our soldiers and veterans up really bad.
Yeah.
Because they're missing out on that aspect.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you have to push them towards faith. You have to address that topic, because otherwise, if you don't, they can't wrestle with the ramifications of that.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really profound. I mean, look, whether you call yourself a Catholic or whatever, or Mormon, you can't deny that there's like a spiritual component of life.
Oh, yeah.
You don't even have to bring religion into it. So much of our culture denies that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, in general, hard for people to talk about.
Right.
So I agree with you. I think it all goes back to spirituality.
It's interesting because, and I'll share this quickly, I was leading a class for Colorado State University. It's a master's degree program where it's basically students who want to become clinicians to deal with first responders and military veterans, and what they go through. And so when I talk about the spiritual component, I said, look, some of you might be going, yeah, right now. And I go, but what is the most popular book series in human history at the moment? And people are like, Harry Potter? And I'm like, correct.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's because people are hungry for something supernatural and otherworldly, and it puts them in this, And I said, but then on top of that, if you consider certain aspects of just life and spirituality and the divine, like, you have to wrestle with those aspects. And we're doing ourselves a disservice especially in the communities, by cutting the humanities and philosophy, because
absolutely.
like you take classes like about existentialism.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a human being?
Right.
If you can't wrestle with that question, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So
yeah, so much of our pressures in our society are turning us into like robots.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to embrace our humanity. I mean, that's what we are. That's what makes us special. We have to understand that. And part of it is spirituality. And a big part of spirituality is serving and caring and being empathetic to other people, and finding no shame in that. It's not weakness, it's strength.
Yeah.
Benjamin, thank you on so many levels. Thanks for your service. Thanks for your excellent book. I recommend it highly to everybody. It's very important. thanks for the work that you're doing, continue to do with veterans and other people suffering from trauma.
I appreciate that. And I mean, it means a lot coming from somebody who's a prolific author and screenwriter as yourself. So I was just, when you reached out, I was honored.
Oh, it's my honor, man. It's my honor.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Benjamin Sledge left the Army in 2010 with the rank of Staff Sergeant. 10 years later, he started writing down his experiences in combat and the problems he had dealing with PTSD and adjusting to civilian life. He said, and I quote, "I wanted to tell the story of what happens 10 years after the events of coming home. When you've been involved in this and you have to live with the person that you are, and you're in a society that you no longer feel is home to you anymore. I wanted to tell a true war story, but the cowardice in me wanted to stay safe and make it look like I was awesome. But I realized that in order for me to write a true horror story, I couldn't do that. The cowardice in my own heart and what people thought of me had to die. The result is the gripping, honest, and highly personal book Where Cowards Go to Die, published in 2022. It's a gold medal winner in Nonfiction Book Awards for biography and memoir, and a 2023 International Book Award finalist. We thank Ben for his excellent book and for his honesty, bravery, and service to our country. It's my great honor to name Benjamin Sledge as today's Hero Behind the Headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzullo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Orchestra and score provided by Extreme Music. Please comment, share, and subscribe to Heroes Behind Headlines.